Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. My guest today is the world's most famous and influential doomer optimist, Ashley Fitzgerald. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
What is a doomer optimist?
Oh man, it's so funny because like from the beginning of coining this term, doomer optimism, we've been so intentional about not being too legible. I think partially because as soon as you name something, then all of a sudden people want to pigeonhole it as something or be able to, easily throw it off or make fun of it or whatever. However, having said that, it's just like a sort of broad orientation, I would say, toward I was just tweeting about this today, like toward life, toward meaning, toward recognizing that maybe not even uniquely that we face various struggles in life, and I don't even necessarily think it's unique to modernity. I mean, humans have always faced some kind of struggle. Maybe some of our issues are uniquely modern, but recognizing that those like various issues exist and then thinking about how to navigate the world despite those things. And so it can take a lot of forms. It kind of initially formed out of a group of people who I think are like neo back to the land or homesteader types who are interested in sort of environmental issues, and that interest sort of forced them to think of practical ways to engage with sustainability. And then that kind of there's like this whole subgroup of us who have learned how to do some stuff on the land, have chickens, maybe even become small farmers, that kind of thing. But since the beginning of the podcast that formed out of this term doomer optimism, it's expanded to a lot of different arenas like family, like education, like religion, just thinking about how to live basically in the world in which we live, how to not be naive about the doom that we face and be realistic and clear-eyed about it, but then ask practical questions about like what does that mean going forward, like recognizing the doom, what then is the like following that logic, what's the necessary step towards optimism.
So doomer optimism is an orientation toward life.
Yeah.
And then what keeps every human being in the world from being a doomer optimist if we're all in some way oriented toward life?
Well, this is the thing. I actually think that in modernity, and actually I think this is the case with a lot of late empires, there's actually a lot of orientation towards nihilism and death. And there is a lot of ideologies that sort of draw people toward the death drive, whether it's like victimhood mentality or truly like self-loathing, or all these various mentalities that are, I guess kind of hating your own biology and body and therefore altering it through various forms of transhumanism. Like, pick your poison. There are a bunch of poisons out there. And I think I've become increasingly religious and think of these things as like demonic forces. But yeah, I mean, I think in fact, a lot of people are drawn towards just pure doom, to their own demise. And then I think also there is a subgroup of people who are just kind of naively optimistic, or like they kind of have their heads in the sand on some of the issues that exist and like don't really want to learn that much about them and aren't moving toward the life drive in like a thoughtful or realistic way about like the actual world that we live in. And so sometimes that could be sometimes that can be a bad path, because all of a sudden you're going along, naively optimistic, and then some crisis hits and then you don't know how to deal with it because you're not like engaging with some of the realities around, things that you've been naive about. So doom or optimism is in that sphere where it's like you have to both kind of be clear-eyed about the doom and like learn about it to the extent that it's necessary for your thriving, but then, choose life despite the doom.
So, doom or optimism is an attempt to distinguish a group of people from the another group of people who are oriented toward a kind of nihilistic transhumanist future,
Yep.
and to distinguish this same group from sort of what we might think of as the unthinking consumerist normie who is oblivious to these combating ideological forces in the world.
Right, right. And not just like, and the latter group, I don't want to like denigrate too much because yeah, we want to just be able to live our lives, right? And be normal and not be like so internet brained and like focused on all these various nihilistic things or, doomsday things. But I'm also kind of a prepper mentality in the sense that like, civilization is just unstable. It can be very unstable. And so you need to just be somewhat aware of like the forces that exist out there in the world that might not lead to your thriving. And so, that's another thing. It's kind of like it's a little bit of like a American Jeffersonian self-sufficient citizenry orientation of like, we can't really rely on these systems that are in place necessarily. We should just be prepared at different scales, especially the community scale, for whatever fact of history might play out in our lifetimes.
So is doom or optimism a movement or an organization?
Um, well, okay, so I said at the beginning that we're trying to keep it. Jason Snyder and I are the ones who kind of happened upon this term. And I said at the beginning, we tried to keep it kind of illegible, and we've continued to do that because I think there's some element where too much self-consciousness can really kill something that's like fun and emergent and where people can sort of find one another. There's just like the thing is it's such a heterodox group of people who fit this category. Like it could go from literally like maybe progressive Black urban farmers to like libertarian Second Amendment, rural, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of different subgroups that fit in this orientation of like recognizing the doom, but having a form of optimism that they work toward. So I would say it's just kind of like uh, like a like a lighthouse or a North Star or something like that, where it's like a beacon that people can kind of come to see a part of themselves in, and then ideally find others who kind of fit their subgenre or their group of interests within it, and then they can go and do whatever they want to do. And I have like a really strong sense that um once people find one another, they're like it's really not their creativity. If they have that drive, it's like endless. And so it's really just a matter of providing the connections for people.
But there is no Doom or Optimism Inc. There's no Doom or Optimism organization that you
No,
can.
the main thing, so I would say there's a couple of things that like are actual enterprises um that exist. So there's the podcast, and the way our podcast works is and we kind of just stumbled into this. None of this it was very like iterative, which I like. It just was experimental and very low stakes and very informal, which made it feel really fun. But the podcast basically started because I and Jason were joking around on Twitter and kind of just came up with this term, doomer optimist. We're like, we're the Doomer Optimists. And then Jason's friend Peter Lindbergh has this podcast called The Stoa, and he invited us to come on and do a series of episodes on the Stoa on this topic of doomer optimism. And then we were like, wow, this concept kind of has legs. Let's start our own podcast. Then we started doing podcasts with a group of hosts, and we decided if anyone has ever been a guest, they're welcome to then be a host on the podcast, which has been really fun because then we've had 5 or 6 different subgroups of people who they themselves have their own set of interests, and then they'll bring on 5 or 6 guests and they'll explore whatever topics they're interested in. So it's been a really nice network effect type thing because of that. So there's the podcast, and that has kind of built a friend group. And you have these long form conversations with people where they open up quite a bit. And so then you get to know somebody really quickly. And then, sometimes you really resonate with someone and you become friends, and then you start meeting up. And then the other thing that's going on is I personally have started organizing events. I feel like there's one thing that's kind of missing in the world is somewhat illegible, very small, intimate, but a little bit informal, conferences, retreats where you get to meet other people like you who are thinking on your same topics. A lot of people who are in the doomer optimism universe are people like Peter Allen is my friend who's a small farmer. He's just kind of super genius guy, but he just went off into the woods of Wisconsin with his family. Has been living off grid for a decade. They don't have a lot of groups where they're hanging out and talking ideology or just talking about their worldview, talking about their approach and why. A lot of people are kind of lone wolves. And so these kind of events where people can get together and just compare notes and just have fun together too. I mean, we had this event at the Wagon Box in Wyoming, which is my friend Paul McNeil's place. And it was all the guys are doing cold plunges in the morning in the little creek there. And some people were trout fishing, and people were cooking together, and lots of families came. And so, just this sense of connection and conviviality. That's another thing that I'm that's been kind of another real organizational outcome of doomer optimism.
Is that going to continue? Do you think
Yep.
you'll continue to kind of formalize this group in some way?
Well, that's a big question that I'm still going to just keep trying to navigate because Paul Kingsnorth is a writer who is very, very aligned with the kinds of topics the doomer optimists are interested in. And he came to that first Wyoming event in the Wagon Box. And that was such a kind of a watershed moment for me, at least, because I was just wow, there's actually quite a network, I think, that wants to come into existence, that maybe I'm called to help shepherd into existence. But I don't exactly know if I'm I'm not even calling it doomer optimism. It's just something I see, these themes are things that are emerging. People want to meet each other. I would say, just so taking a step down as a sociologist, I think during the pandemic, a lot of people went online and found one another, and were maybe just in their lives and going about their lives, and then reevaluated some things during the pandemic and found one another. Now we're in this post-pandemic phase where people really want to meet each other and connect and do real things together. And so Paul Kingsnorth is coming back to the United States in October, and he asked me to organize something, another small 50-person retreat with this other author who talks about some of these topics, Matthew Crawford. So I've organized that. That's already going. It's sold out in an hour. And then this other author who works with Paul Kingsnorth, Dugald Hine, is coming to the United States, and he's also asked me to do something. So I'm I've become this party planner for the doomer optimist world and adjacent worlds. And each event has its own kind of like reason to exist. And so it's not necessarily like my vision. I'm just more like midwifing, to use another metaphor.
You've mentioned several times the themes that are emerging. What would you say are the two or three big themes that are at the heart of all this?
Yeah. One of them is out to pull a term that Kingsnorth uses, but I think is a much older term, is this concept of the machine. So the machine being this kind of like um it could be both authoritarian government overreach, it could be surveillance, it could be transhumanism, it could be like um consumerism, where it's just like kind of this looming entity of modernity that's making it hard for us to thrive. So that's one theme that where a lot of people kind of recognize this machine. Another theme that is really resonant is the theme of scale and localism. And so, like the idea that, we have overscaled our society and lives. So, like, too much corporate power, too much state power, getting back involved in a human scale of life, whether it's like getting involved in part of your community, your church, your school, just Girl Scouts, kids sports, just, this kind of like civic life. And that, I guess that would be another theme, this civic orientation. And then finally, I think a lot of us are interested in like a practical or lived sustainability. There's a subgroup of Southerners who have done a couple of episodes who are like imagining this ecological Americana future of megafauna, and maybe you're bringing back extinct megafauna or you're bringing in megafauna from the other parts of the world, and like just imagining like a more alive environment. And then finally, there's like a subgroup that's kind of forming around like how does working class how do working class issues fit into these? What is populism? Well, how would populism work with things like sustainability and localism? And Matt Crawford, who's going to come and talk to Kingsnorth in October, um, he talks a lot about like the right to repair type stuff, like basically appropriate technology. And like a lot of working class people like want control over their machines. They don't want the machines to be controlling them or surveilling them. So that's another theme that's been, kind of floating around in this universe.
Why do you think those themes are interesting to people right now when 10 years ago they were less interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think sociologically, a lot of these themes come up at points of crisis in people's personal lives or societal crisis. So, like, I started getting interested in many of these themes um, right after graduating college, which was in 2007. And there's like this financial crisis and like TARP. And I'm like realizing all these different bills were like, just covering up Wall Street. And then Occupy Wall Street happened. And then Tea Party. And like, this feeling of unrest like made me ask these questions about, well, how does our society work? Like, and how do I need to protect myself from this? Like, what is the upshot of this? So that's what kind of brought me to it. But I think there are waves where things are sort of more or less stable, increasingly less. There's increasingly less periods of time of like just pure stability. And now, like with each kind of crisis where people feel sort of unstable or unsafe, it leads them to ask these questions about like, how do these things work actually? And then once you learn how they work, you ask, what can I do about it? How can I go forward in the world with this knowledge now that I have about, how the financial system works, or like government overreach and COVID, or, any kind of crisis that happens, people think like, okay, I need to look into this actually, because this is a little bit disorienting.
As I think about what you're saying, I remember Simone Weil, the Christian writer, who said attention is prayer. And it seems to me that what you're really talking about is an attempt to redirect attention. Right.
Yep.
And I have been reading a book by a woman who's mostly forgotten in the American literary tradition, whose name was Gladys Taber. And Gladys Taber is forgotten in part because she wrote for women's magazines for many years. And her writing has a kind of domestic feel, but she is an extraordinary observer of nature. So she writes long pieces about the skunk who lives in her yard.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that part of what you're talking about is, and I mean, what power does the machine have except to command attention?
That's right. That's right. And actually, one thing that I'm always fighting with people about, and I guess this goes back to the kinds of nihilism that draws people in, but the part of the nihilism, one of the most pervasive forms of nihilism that exists now is this sense of victimhood, which then draws people's attention to the ways in which they are not empowered, the ways in which they're controlled, the ways in which the machine has taken over life and they have no agency. And part of, I think, my gospel is like this idea of empowerment and agency at a scale that's accessible. And so I think it's really like I love this, idea of like just, paying attention to your own domestic sphere and paying attention to the nature around your house. Like it doesn't really have to be a grand top-down vision of sustainability for you to go out in your yard and plant some tomatoes and flowers, And so I think part of it, of the disempowering message, is that all the problems are at such a scale that all the solutions have to be at that scale, which then makes people spiral into victimhood. And I would say, the attention that you're bringing up, like it really, if you refocus your attention toward agency and a scale at which you can have agency, a whole other realm of existence opens up. The whole other realm of possibility opens up because you can see like people spiral into this idea that they have no agency unless they're like in actual power at some state or national scale. And I'm like, there's so much agency to be had everywhere.
I bring up Simone Weil and the notion of attention as prayer because it seems to me that, and you brought this up earlier, there's obviously a spiritual dimension to all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we want to talk about the machine, which I understand that term came from Kingsnorth's essay, I think called "The Machine and the Cross," published.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
First thing,
the cross and the machine. But I think he was pulling it from some earlier, like earliest 20th century writers.
And obviously what he means by the machine is the whole mechanism of modernity.
Yes.
Whose function it is to command attention, right?
Yep.
And essentially to get people to pray to it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is part of his point in that essay too, is that there is at the very least, a tension, if not a flat out enmity, between the cross and the machine, because the machine is sort of seeking the prayer and the worship in a way, which ought to go to the cross. How has all this made you more religious?
So, I think probably it comes back to the idea that a lot of what is problematic about life in modernity is, I think, a sense that, like, a hubristic sense that we can create our own meaning.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's just not how it works. Meaning comes down from tradition, from culture, and I think a lot of us, like we, I've just seen like this absurd hoop jumping of like recreating religion. A lot of people do, just to find some sense of meaning. People will do like so many mental backflips to like become a Buddhist rather than a Christian, just to kind of like have some orientation that answers moral questions, and questions of virtue and questions of um, how to navigate the difficulties of life. And um, I think it, like I said, it's a hubristic um, issue because, more or less this is a religion is a sort of scaffolding. It's a sociological and cultural scaffolding, on which that kind of helps us navigate this realm of questions of like how to live virtuously and what to do in times of suffering and trauma and loss. And I grew up going to church, and so did my husband, and a lot of people of our generation, I think, kind of learned, we're above that, we're beyond that. Like, you go to college, we have this rationalistic approach to understanding the world. That's enough. Like, science can answer all those questions. And then you just realize the limits to that. Like, science really can't answer some of these moral questions. And in fact, if you look to rationalistic explanations of things, it can really drive you to very unpleasant conclusions. And I've come up with this term spreadsheet brain, to describe this because I have been in various meetings throughout my career as like I've got my PhD in environmental sociology, and I've been in these meetings where people are really very, very confused on answers to big questions of virtue and morality because they are trying to answer some of these questions through the lens of like rationalistic science, and then they'll literally just like be driven by the spreadsheets and lose all the context of the world in which they're trying to understand. And so basically, I've just come around to the fact that there needs to be like a different kind of moral scaffolding, that's more qualitative, but also, I would say, like, more comprehensive and more contextual, because there are just certain mysteries that can't be solved through rationalistic science. And then some, just like on a practical note, I grew up going to church, so did my husband, and I think it's really kind of selfish to not give your kids the same scaffolding. And so we started going back to church because I think as an adult, you can say like, oh, I'll just let my kids decide themselves when they get to adulthood. But actually that leads to quite a bit of suffering, because I think people then think of religion as some sort of like consumer choice. Like, I can pick one of 10 things off the shelf, but then I have to like explore all these 10 things. And like, I've just seen a lot of people suffer going through like, now I'm big into astrology, now I'm big into Buddhism, oh, now I'm like, yoga is my religion now, and it's like, it's people suffer a lot in that seeking process. And I think it's a lot more humane to just, there's so many questions to answer in the world. Just give your kids that scaffolding. They don't necessarily have to feel pressured to go into that same religion you raise them in as they get older, but they have that as a background. and they don't have to learn it all as an adult, which can be very overwhelming and very awkward. And so, I just came to that realization, like, I just need to give my kids this cultural, experience of going to church and knowing the rules and knowing the sacraments and being baptized and being confirmed and all that. And then, that'll be that's their heritage. That's their background. It was the heritage given to me as a child, and I'd like to pass it on to them.
It seems to me that there's something beyond all that, right? That the question beyond all of that, beyond the religion as a scaffolding for personal and cultural endurance, etc., is the question of truth and whether or not it's true. And it seems to me that the reason to go to church or to become more religious is that you think it's true. And is it not the case that almost what doomer optimism is trying to do is to find a way within the machine to allow people to live with some source of truth other than the machine, and that the machine has that maybe, I don't know if this is true, but let me throw it out there. It seems to me that the machine is fundamentally built around excluding from people's minds the possibility of any kind of truth that comes from a transcendent source. So within the machine, it seems to me you have something we might call science, though if you think about science long enough, it seems like it ultimately dissolves into certain kinds of subjectivity too.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have truth is simply personal preference of some sort.
Right.
But what both of those have in common is that they come out of the materialist world, whether it comes from inside your preferences or it comes outside of you in the form of spreadsheet brain. So is what doomer optimism is trying to do is open up space for people to live in the light of some other kind of truth that comes from a transcendent source.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's true. I would say, to me, I have like a very, very tolerant and pluralistic approach to, like, however you need to find truth. Like, in some cases, this way, like, I make fun of spreadsheet brain, but in some cases, there's certain modes of scientific inquiry that actually do help us to understand more truth and like, which can then inform the transcendent. And I would say there's also some cases in which, like, relativistic, like, arguments, like, well, what works for me doesn't work for you, is fine, but there are just limits to that. And I would say the main thing is, like, to not get stuck in some orthodoxy where you have to, for example, you have to become a vegan because that's what the numbers say. And, like, this is a perfect example of the more transcendent and holistic understanding. If you're like a small regenerative farmer, you understand, like, ecologies and context. You understand that how you manage your animals can increase the biodiversity of a piece of property, but also it's a moral question, a more transcendent question about, like, where are humans in the universe and what is our role? Is our role to minimize suffering in a utilitarian sense, or is it as some species among other species, and are we allowed to, like, consume that species? I mean, that is a moral question. And fundamentally, like, I think for me, in doomer optimism, is you should be able to have those kinds of conversations that can pull in pluralistic forms of thinking and argumentation, but, like, eventually you should be able to come up with some sort of, like, coherent thinking based on first principles. And a lot of the first principles have to do with transcendent truths, like, what is a human, what is our role on earth, and those are those are not questions that could be answered with a spreadsheet. So it's really like and to me, the pluralism is kind of really important at this point in history because there's so much orthodoxy, especially in like modern ideologies, machine ideologies. Like you cannot think outside of these parameters. It's verboten. And to me, I couldn't disagree with that more. I was in this group chat with this very far left guy, and he was saying, I'll only give gardening advice to people who agree with me ideologically. And I was like, that's the opposite of everything I think. I think that you should be able to be neighborly and tolerant and have like heterodox conversations and hear people out. And so I think part of doomer optimism is literally just being able to make a space to like have conversations without this preconceived set of parameters of ways to think.
What was his justification for that? Do you know?
He said, if you don't agree with me, then you should pay me, which was like, that's another like way to shut down conversation, where it's like kind of pay me if you disagree kind of thing. But no, I think the justification I think is basically like, if you're on my team, I will help you in like mutual solidarity. If you're not on my team, I'm not going to help you unless you pay me for it.
That's weird.
But I think it's all there's like a way in which a lot of people police thinking, and in group there's so many different ways in which people police this, and where you really like are not allowed to have wrong think. And so yeah, that's just one example, I think, but there's tons of ways in which people do that.
And I think your contention is that impulse to police is itself an extension of the machine.
Yes, it is. It totally is. And I think it is anti-resilient. It's anti-self-sufficient, like in the sense of going back to like a Jeffersonian vision of America. Part of the Jeffersonian vision, at least my interpretation of it, is the power of the regular citizenry to create a civic pride and a civic orientation. And the only way that civic orientation can function is through tolerance of difference in your neighbors, because in the United States, we are not one religion, one culture. We've come from all over the world. And so some tolerance and plurality is completely essential for the functioning of this kind of country in the new world. And so to me, it's really like kind of old world tribal thinking to say you have to agree with me 100% ideologically to be in my club. Not to say that there aren't some, of course, cases where you do want to make a club that's that's got insiders and outsiders, but like the civic orientation, something like learning how to garden or teaching your neighbor how to garden, fundamentally is one where you should not be having those kind of purity tests.
It's very interesting. I think we're now recording maybe the 24th or 25th episode of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm beginning to see certain themes emerge. And I assume it's because because I always have the same interests, and I select guests who have similar interests. So Lafayette Lee was on a while back, and I played devil's advocate with him, and I'm going to do it with you here for a second. So if you have this Jeffersonian vision of America in which diversity is tolerated, etc., what then ties people together has to be some conception of essentially human reason, right? Like, well, that we're all rational people and we can debate and all this. But isn't that tolerance of diversity and the belief in the rational individual and the rational individual's ability to kind of weigh out his interests, etc., and put those into political action. Isn't that exactly what's led us here to the ascendancy of the machine?
Yeah, I would say I mean, that's true in the sense that when taken to its extreme and kind of left unchecked from moral questions. And so I do think fundamentally, like, first of all, I think to get people to work together, they ought to have some sort of project in mind. What is the project? What's the mutual goal? So if I'm working like, I get involved in my kids' local school. The goal is to educate these kids well, for them to thrive, for them to have a good school experience, to set them up for life. And so then you're asking practical questions about how to do that. But underlying those practical questions has to be some sort of base shared morality or shared set of values of what is a good education actually, and what would thriving look like. And so, that's just endlessly difficult in a pluralistic society, and especially if you get somebody in there who's like extremely spreadsheet brained, and they're just going to be like, we just need to, pump these kids full of X, Y, and Z knowledge so that they can get good standardized test scores. And then you get somebody who comes in and says, their qualitative experience of school should be like, enriching their lives and social lives and sports and this kind of thing. So no, I mean, I think that it's always going to be a balance of, on the one end, kind of like pluralistic tolerance, which then you just have to kind of navigate where you can find points of shared values and practical ways to go forward. This is like what all local politics is. And then on the other end of the extreme, you just can't let like the belief in the hyper rationalist individual run amok, like go to such a far extreme that it then becomes a way, like a cudgel, to control people, or like, a way in which people are only allowed to think in that direction.
This is basically the answer that Lafayette Lee gave as well.
Okay, yeah, he and I agree on a lot.
The but the next question is to say, hasn't that process failed?
Well, okay, so this is actually a hugely important question to my life in particular, because I just came back from 7 years in Uruguay in South America. And I moved to Uruguay partially because I thought the answer to that question was yes, which was yes, American institutions have failed to the point that I don't want to raise my kids in that country. And I truly believed this when I left when I bought land in 2012 and then moved in 2016. I I truly believed that, like, for example, the American school system has failed children to the point that I don't want to subject my children to it. And, I think part of it too is, like, as a very new mother, you have this newborn baby, you really don't know what the system is, but you want to protect your little helpless infant at all costs, and so you do extreme things to protect your child from. At the time, I was most worried about, like, forcible prescription of, like, ADHD medications. And now I'm worried about other things. But over the years, I realized other places, like Uruguay is a great country, but it has just some version of failures itself. And every place has somewhere along the spectrum more or less social failures. And I think now my orientation, we moved back to Chicago, partially because the network of people we have here and our family and friends is so powerful that, like, I didn't realize at the time how important that network is to, like, just power in life and local community. But then now I'm much more nuanced about this question of failure. And I actually think the answer that things have systematically failed is nihilistic, in a sense that it makes people drop out or run away from their potential power and agency in a civic role. And so now I'm all about, like, getting involved in this level of local politics and civic um, organizations, church, school, Girl Scouts, local sports, all of this stuff. But as a mother, to a mother in the community, a mother to neighbor kids, like, these institutions have not really failed, actually, and many of them will fail if you have a wholesale um, defection from them. And so this is an inflection point, I would say, where it's like, either a lot of us take up the mantle and get involved and, like, shape these institutions so that they don't fully go under, or a bunch of people defect and try to start new things. But I've also become very pessimistic about the idea that it's easier to start new institutions than it is to just infiltrate the ones that exist and make them shape to your will. Like, I've seen so many, like, for example, new schools or intentional communities, or they've risen and fallen so quickly because it's really hard to make new institutions. And so what is the actual answer if you think institutions have failed? It's either to go start a new one, but then you're taking on huge risk when you do that.
All right, two more questions and then we can wrap up. When I talk about failure, first of all, let me say I'm asking you difficult questions, but not because I'm committed to some opposing point of view.
Oh, no, yeah, that's great.
I want to know what you think. So when I talk about failure, I'm talking about at a level deeper than at institutions. So the answer that I've gotten is that if we take to its extreme the liberal notion of tolerance of difference based around an anthropology of the rational citizen, okay, to its extreme, then yeah, that's a problem. But we can interpose into that restraining moral and principles, et cetera, that keep that from going to its extreme. That's the answer that I've heard. But what I'm asking is, has that process not failed? Have we not failed at interposing the restraining principles that allow our kind of rational and radical individualism, or that prevent our radical and rational individualism from going to its extreme and natural conclusion? So, like, I'm asking, has our political project not failed at the fundamental level of ideas?
Yeah, right. No, I understand that. So first of all, I think the answer is it depends what and where you're talking about. I think it has failed in some places, much more catastrophically than in others. And so, like, take to the extreme, I would say, in my opinion, some of the wealthiest communities in the United States are the most machine and have had the most failure, where they're just doing so many kind of transhumanist surgeries, literally from the trans stuff to, like, boob jobs, and everybody's in the machine, everybody's, like, lost meaning, everybody's on antidepressants, everyone's doing drugs, like, it's all just so extreme. And then in the poorest communities too, I would say, of course, there's just tons of failures of this project. I was just reading today about, like, in San Francisco trying to put homeless people into some kind of housing, and it's just, like, actually such a failure, because they're just the problem isn't necessarily just housing, it's like the whole social contract and behavior, and, like, people are literally just, like, living among rodents in these hotels, and all sorts of super antisocial behavior. But I do think in the middle somewhere there are communities like my own, the one I came from, that I kind of like, I had such doom colored glasses on. I couldn't see at the time like the fundamentals of this community, but I grew up and I'm now back in this community in Chicago that's like still has a big working class element. A lot of people are firemen and policemen in this neighborhood. There's like a modesty to it, but there's an orientation towards family. A lot of people still go to church. There's like a various I would say festivals that make social cohesion. So there's like the Southside Irish Parade, and there's this local run that happens every year, and there's these ways in which there's a civic orientation. There's a sense of normalcy, and for example, I encountered at my kids' school, which is Chicago Public Schools, their curriculum for like sex ed curriculum. And part of it had like puberty blockers are fine. And so then I started talking with local parents. Now, obviously, this curriculum came down from the administration for the whole city. And then I'm talking with local parents, and they're just not on board with that being taught. And so a lot of the parents are taking their kids out and they're talking to the sex ed teacher. And then I went and talked to the sex ed teacher, and she was like, I don't even agree with this. And so like there's a way in which there's like the machine comes in and it's trying to get a grasp on some of these places, and then there's a way in which like people are, if they show up, they fight back from those things in some places. And I think like the question then of the coming decades is where to put your efforts. And like you were saying, attention is prayer. Where to pay attention, where to show up, what parts of this process are not all failure, and basically where to orient yourself so that you're effective, and making sure that this thing is not completely lost.
Another question that's come up on this podcast before is the question of meaning. And so I ask you, you've referred to the crisis of meaning multiple times in this conversation. What do you mean when you say meaning?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean both social belonging and an orientation toward life, so toward something. What do you get out of bed for in the morning? What is it that you're called to do that's bigger than yourself, that drives you forward? And so I would say it's the combination of those things. It's like your vocation for your life, and that could be like being a mother, and doing a podcast, or whatever it is that you're drawn to, building an app. I don't care, as long as you're drawn towards something and you actually believe in it. And then I would say the social belonging, which is like I'm doing something for other people, like for society, for my kids, for my family. I'm going to my parents' house and cleaning their gutters. It's like this cohesion, interdependence, I would say.
Yeah, part of what came up in another conversation was that when we talk about meaning, it's easy to think, maybe this is to be spreadsheet brained, but it's easy to think that when we talk about meaning, we're referring to something that's purely cognitive. But obviously, for people to have meaningful lives, there has to be an effective element to it. People have to feel that meaning. And so it occurs to me that in the end, the most pernicious effect of the machine is that it makes it more difficult for the individual human being to experience love. And that this is why it is opposed to the cross. This is ultimately why it's opposed to the cross, because it interferes. It actively tries to prevent the human being from experiencing love. And that it is in our experience of love that we have meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what doomer optimism trying in some sense to make it more possible for people to have that experience?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is you have to have a conversation with Nate. He's our resident psychotherapist, but also resident hippie. And he and I have had this conversation a few times where we were like, fundamentally, this is supposed to be like a triumph of love. And by that, so much is encompassed in that concept of love, but it includes like openness and vulnerability and tolerance and compassion. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely, and it's just like, I mean, there's not really much to say about it because it's all sounds so cliche. The more you talk about like love as opposed
That's
to,
how we know it's true.
yeah, right, as love as opposed to hate, or love as opposed to, indifference, but or this it's really to me, I'm of course using these Freudian like terms, but this drive towards life is the drive towards love. The meaning is this orientation toward loving things and putting your attention towards them and your prayer towards them and your affection, care. All of these things are essential to a life well lived. And I think part of it is that the doom and the nihilism and the death drive just kind of robs us of that power. And I think a lot of people just don't think about love, care, attention, affection, prayer. Those things are actually empowering and in our hands to do now. And it's demonic. I mean, there's no other word for it, but it's like it's the devil who is telling you like you should hate things, you should hate yourself, you should hate those who are crushing you. And this orientation towards hate and death and victimhood, like this it's just going to lead to ruin for you, and the opposite is step into your power, but power is like, your responsibility. But yeah, I would say a lot of people, I think, are resist that because it seems more safe somehow, or less responsibility to just lean into the hate, into the nihilism. Everything's out of my control.
It seems safer because it's safer.
Yeah. You're not taking a risk. You're not putting yourself out there. But then you're getting no reward. You're just constantly in a spiral of doom and self-loathing. And so, yeah, it is an orientation towards love, but love is not like, it's not all roses. It's really, it's hard work.
All right. On that note, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This was great.
All right. Well, maybe we can do it again sometime.